My first question is how many different diseases do you think long COVID is? Is it one? Is it two? Is it five? What do you think?
Yeah, long COVID is really a multi-systemic disease. It doesn't really, there's no one long COVID. There are likely to be many subtypes, and our understanding of long COVID now is actually literally embryonic, is it infancy, that we've made a lot of progress over the past several years, but we need to also recognize that we've only been researching this and understanding long COVID for literally only 4 years, and I sort of tell people when we first sort of start thinking and discovering neoplasm or tumor growth or cancer, we sort of define, oh, this is a lump or this is a cancer. And now we have 800 different types of cancer because we understand the biology more, we understand the molecular and genetic fingerprints of cancer much more deeply. We understand sort of tissue-based biology of cancer much more deeply than we did, let's say, 50 years ago. And long COVID is the same thing. Long COVID is sort of really this post-viral illness or the lingering or enduring problems that happen after SARS-CoV-2 infection. It can, what we know so far, it can affect nearly every organ system. It can affect the heart, the brain, can have metabolic, sequelae. And we're starting to sort of see studies sort of subtyping long COVID into different types. There are cardinal manifestations that a lot of the listeners or the audience might have heard. Brain fog, fatigue, post-exertional malaise, or some form of dysautonomia people call, or POS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or more broadly dysautonomia or a dysfunction in the autonomic nervous system that would lead to subsequent manifestations. Those are the cardinal manifestations, but there's really almost like there is no organ in the body now, like 4 years into it, that long COVID does not touch.
One of the audience questions was whether you see a similarity between long COVID and MECFS, encephalopathy, chronic fatigue. And I'm really interested in this because on one hand, I could see it being a good framework to understand these conditions as similar, but also it could be a disservice if they're different. What do you think?
I think there is a lot of overlap. I mean, and MECFS itself, first of all, to start with the origin of MECFS, is also thought to be triggered by a viral illness, by a flu-like illness, a viral illness. So the onset of MECFS doesn't happen in vacuum. It actually triggered initially by a viral illness. So that's sort of our likely common etiologic drivers. It may not be the same virus, but it's triggered by a viral illness. There's a lot of overlap in the symptomatology, fatigue, brain fog, post-exertional malaise, POTS. There's quite a bit of overlap in the symptomatology between MECFS and long COVID. It doesn't mean that they're all identical, that all the facets are identical. It just means that it sort of gives us hints. The viruses are giving us hints that, what viruses, or that we thought initially they only cause acute problems or acute disease, can in some instances lead to chronic illness or chronic disease. And the MECFS is one example. COVID is another example. And one of the arguments that actually I think find really interesting is that had we as a community of scientists listened to MECFS patients long time ago and really understood did better and more research on it, we'd actually be better and more equipped and more able to address the challenges of long COVID more. But we just ignored it. We literally had the Spanish flu pandemic. Droves of people got disabled as a result. We just ignored them and ignored their plight. And ECFS happened. We just ignored them and ignored their plight. And we got now caught unprepared for long COVID.
This is like three questions in one. I often think of COVID as kind of like we're present at a supernova, and then we're going to be living in the penumbra of that background radiation for the next billion years. It's never going to go away, and that every single coronavirus that we call a seasonal coronavirus now, at one point in the past had that supernova. We just weren't present for it, like you just described with influenza, because 100 years 100 years ago, humanity was present for that supernova. Do you think that because of that, that over time, as the population gets more immunity, more exposures, which is not good, but over time, 50 years from now, or even 10 years from now, that long COVID will become less likely as the population gains sort of familiarity with it?
It's possible. We don't know this for sure. Obviously, we're trying to sort of forecast 10 years down the road. It's possible. On one hand, it could be that the sort of more immunity from repeated exposure that's a hypothesis. So it's very, very clear to make sure for the audience that the hypothesis, I don't have data for this, will sort of make then, coronavirus infection, the 10th coronavirus infection, inconsequential, clinically and inconsequential. But it's also possible that repeated exposure can, in some individuals, can also alter the immune system in some ways that make them actually more predisposed to a variety of adverse events down the road. It's really not clear, but I think this really deserves a lot of more sort of fleshing out and vetting over the next several years. Remember, like we sort of think about the pandemic, this is only the 5th year. I mean, this is literally our understanding of all of this is still literally in its infancy.
Mm-hmm. And related to that, what is your current hypothesis on what the cause is? And I'll preface this by sharing a conversation I had with David Boulware, who's one of the lead authors of the metformin trial that showed that if you take metformin during your acute illness, there was a big reduction in downstream long COVID. And David was really convinced that's an antiviral property of metformin that is causing that. And I said, well, look, Dave, that may be true, but there's also could be an anti-inflammatory component here that is the body's immune reaction. And I was trying to convince him. I said, look, I don't know the answer, but if it's an anti-inflammatory reaction, it's a bigger deal because that would actually suggest that metformin might help with other viruses that might cause longer term syndromes.
Yeah, so the David data is exciting. That finally like something works. And like metformin in the acute phase can actually reduce the risk of long COVID later on. We'd like to see that reproduce in other settings, so sort of to elevate our confidence in that. But sort of going back to the mechanisms, it's at this point I sort of think that the viral persistence hypothesis is really compelling, and that there is clearly evidence actually in autopsy studies in people who have severe COVID-19, that there is viral persistence in extrapulmonary sites, not only in the lung but in the brain and in the coronary arteries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that sort of suggests that at least in people who have severe disease, that's not everyone, that the virus actually might persist for a long period of time in extrapulmonary sites. And there's also a lot of sort of thinking and literature about that viral persistence sort of potentially mediating some of the consequences of that we see in long COVID. The other hypothesis that I think is actually quite interesting is that of microbiome dysbiosis. So viruses and bacteria actually interact. So they're not like viruses. They don't only attack or human hosts or human or mammalian cells or human cells. Viruses are they're indiscriminate. They go and wreak havoc in all our systems. And guess what? In our system, there are actually more bacterial cells, more microbiome cells than human cells. And the idea is that those are in some way disturbed. That ecosystem is disturbed, and then subsequently might lead to disease. The immune dysfunction hypothesis is actually very, very interesting. There was a sort of recently work came out of UCSF, really wonderful work, wonderful paper, sort of arguing or sort of describing discoordinated response between the T and B cells, and that discoordinated response is sort of really what drives much of the manifestations that we see in long COVID. I think the super clever finding, and actually in their interpretations, beautiful work, is that this is really maybe why it explains why long COVID is tissue-based disease. So you think about like why is long COVID not like a heart disease only or a brain disease only, right? It's not organ specific, it's everywhere. There's no specificity. I think this is one of the things that really puzzled us at the beginning. Like, could this be true? Like long COVID can do things in the heart and the brain and the GI system and the kidneys. Like, that's not specific. But then they come up with really this clever explanation. If it's immune dysfunction and sort of can actually explain this sort of tissue-based disease hypothesis. So that's also one other sort of hypothesis that I think needs to be also fleshed out and evaluated further. There is certainly inflammation. During the acute phase, things happen, and then subsequently, an inflammatory cascade is set, is then engaged, and then that might result in post-acute sequela. Those are all I have to say for the audience. These are hypotheses. We don't know that any of this really fully explains the human phenotype. A lot of this also these results are generated in either in vitro, like totally cell-based data, or animal data. So we don't really know if this really actually explains sort of the human phenotype of long COVID, but I'm really delighted to see this sort of engagement by the research community, immunologists, virologists, like to really decipher long COVID and trying to help us understand like what's happening here, and how can we explain this sort of very diverse phenotype. It's not only heart disease, not only brain disease, it's like all of the above. And it's like, can this be true? Because I'm sort of and I'm pretty sure in your training, like we also think of disease as an organ system based disease. And even specialties are around cardiology, neurology, GI. So even specialties are sort of based around organ systems, right? So that's how sort of our brain is trained. Even in fellowships are organized around that concept. So and this sort of challenges that a little bit because it's like literally a multi-system disorder.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me as a emergency physician of sepsis in a way, in terms of that it's not necessarily just the virus or just the pathogen, it's the host response to that. And that can be anywhere, because anywhere you have an immune tissue in your body, which is everywhere, head to toe.